It is the 4th of November, 1942, and the light is already failing over the Hertfordshire countryside. A lorry rattles down a rutted lane towards a cluster of farm buildings near the village of Aston, its headlamps taped to slits against the blackout. Mist is settling over the fields on either side of the lane, and somewhere in the darkness a dog barks twice and falls silent. To anyone watching from the road, this is nothing more than a tired old estate going about its business. A barn, a stable block, a scatter of outbuildings under corrugated roofs, chickens scratching in the yard, a farmhand closing a gate for the night. But behind the barn doors, under electric light, bright enough to work by, men in shirt sleeves are hunched over a workbench, assembling a pistol no louder than a hardback book dropped onto a carpet. One of them lifts the weapon, checks the fit of a component against the light, and sets it down again without a word. There is no ceremony to this moment. No one here thinks of themselves as making history. They are simply solving a problem, the way an engineer solves any other problem, with patience, with trial and error, and with a great deal of quiet frustration when a design does not work as intended. And yet what they are building in this barn will, within months, be smuggled into occupied Europe inside metal cylinders, dropped by parachute in the dead of night, to be used by men and women whose names will never appear in any official history. This is Aston House, and its owners have told the neighbors it is a training school for army dispatch riders. It is nothing of the sort. It is Station 9 of the Special Operations Executive, and the barn is where Britain is quietly building some of the strangest and deadliest instruments of the Second World War. The pistol on the bench is called the Welrod. It has no visible hammer, no ejection port that catches the light, and a bulbous cylinder around the barrel that swallows the crack of the shot down to something closer to a hand clap, muffled by a glove. A resistance fighter could carry it under a coat, press it to the base of a sentry skull in an alleyway, and be 3 streets away before anyone realized what the sound had been. It was designed, quite deliberately, to kill quietly, and it was built inside a barn that smelled of hay and machine oil in equal measure, in a country lane where the postman still delivered letters and the milkman still made his rounds as though nothing unusual were happening at all. Understanding why Britain needed a weapon like this, and why it needed to build it in secret behind the doors of an ordinary farm, means understanding just how badly conventional soldiering had failed the people of occupied Europe, and just how far Britain was prepared to go to give them something, anything, that might let them fight back. By the winter of 1940, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Norway, Denmark, and Poland lay under German occupation, and Britain had no army left on the continent capable of doing anything about it. The evacuation from Dunkirk had saved roughly 338,000 men, but it had abandoned nearly all their heavy equipment on the beaches, leaving Britain itself dangerously exposed and its continental allies entirely without organized military support. Winston Churchill, casting around for any means of striking back at an enemy who now controlled the coastline from the Arctic Circle to the Pyrenees, ordered the creation of an organization that would, in his own words, set Europe ablaze. The Special Operations Executive was formed in July 1940, with a mandate that sounded almost fantastical for a country fighting for its own survival, to encourage and enable sabotage, subversion, and irregular resistance in territories the regular army could not touch. The trouble was that nobody in Britain had the faintest idea how to equip such an organization, because nothing like it had existed before at this scale. Britain had run irregular warfare campaigns before in the colonies on the northwest frontier, in odd corners of empire, where small numbers of men operated far from conventional supply lines. But nothing had prepared the War Office for the scale of what SOE now proposed. Arming and training clandestine networks of civilians, teachers, farmers, shopkeepers, factory workers, ordinary people with no military background whatsoever, and asking them to fight an occupying army from within their own homes, streets, and workplaces. Conventional military weapons were built for conventional soldiers standing in conventional lines, or at least operating within conventional chains of supply and command. A Lee Enfield rifle was a superb weapon for a British infantryman on a battlefield, but it was roughly 1.13 meters long, weighed close to 4 kilograms, and made a bang that could be heard for over a kilometer in open country. It was useless to a Polish schoolteacher trying to eliminate a single collaborator without bringing the Gestapo down on an entire street the following morning. A standard service revolver was more concealable, small enough to fit inside a coat pocket, but its report would still carry through the thin walls of a Parisian apartment block, echo down a stone stairwell, and bring curious neighbors to their windows within seconds. In a city under occupation, where informers were rewarded and reprisals against entire communities were common practice, that single loud noise could mean not just the death of one agent, but the arrest, torture, and execution of dozens of innocent people living nearby. Agents parachuting into occupied territory needed to move unnoticed, strike unnoticed, and vanish unnoticed, and virtually nothing in the British Armoury had been designed with that requirement in mind. Existing suppressors, where they existed at all, were bulky attachments bolted onto standard pistols as an afterthought, and they reduced the noise only marginally, while making the weapon almost impossible to conceal beneath ordinary civilian clothing. Nobody had sat down and asked what a weapon would look like if silence, rather than stopping power or rate of fire, were the very first requirement on the list. There was a further problem, and it was one of simple arithmetic. SOE estimated it might eventually need to arm and supply agents and resistance cells across a dozen occupied countries, from small sabotage teams working in Norway's fjords, to sprawling Maquis networks, hiding in the forests and hill villages of southern France. Every one of those weapons had to be small enough to be dropped by parachute, in a container barely larger than a filing cabinet, robust enough to survive a rough landing in a ploughed field or a rocky hillside, and simple enough that a farmer or a factory clerk with no military training whatsoever could strip and reassemble it by feel in the dark, in a cellar, with a lookout posted at the top of the stairs. No factory in Britain was set up to design weapons against that brief, because no war before this one had demanded it. The challenge, in short, was to invent an entirely new category of weapon, quietly, quickly, and without the enemy ever learning it existed, all while Britain itself was still fighting for its life against the very real threat of invasion. The solution came from a section of SOE that even most of the British establishment did not know existed. Station 9, based at Aston House near Stevenage in Hertfordshire, under the direction of a small team of engineers led by Major Hugh Reeves. Reeves had trained as an engineer before the war and brought to the job a talent for solving practical problems with unglamorous, workable answers rather than elaborate flourishes. Around him he gathered chemists, machinists, tinkerers, and inventors, some drawn from civilian industry, others plucked from obscure corners of the armed forces, because someone remembered they had a gift for solving mechanical puzzles. They worked not in some purpose-built military laboratory with marble corridors and armed guards at the gate, but in requisitioned farm buildings chosen precisely because they looked unremarkable from the road. The estate had working out buildings already, which meant lorries coming and going, deliveries of crates, and the noise of machinery running at odd hours could all be explained away as ordinary agricultural or training activity to anyone who happened to be passing. Locals were told the site was a training establishment for dispatch riders, a cover story mundane enough that nobody thought to ask further questions, and it held for the entire war. It was, in its own way, as clever a piece of design as anything built inside it. The ordinariness of the barn was the first line of defense, a kind of camouflage built not from paint or netting, but from sheer boredom, the simple fact that nobody looks twice at a farm. Inside, the Welrod pistol took shape as a deliberately minimalist weapon, built from the ground up around a single, uncompromising requirement. It had to be as close to silent as physics would allow. It fired a standard 9mm round, chosen because ammunition in that caliber was already common across occupied Europe and would not stand out if an agent were searched. But everything else about the weapon broke from convention. The barrel was drilled with a series of small holes along its length, venting propellant gases into an expansion chamber, packed with rubber baffles before they ever reached the open air. Think of it rather like a shower head, slowing and softening a jet of water into a gentle spray. By the time the gases escaped the muzzle, most of their violent energy had already been absorbed and dispersed, rather than exploding outward in one sudden, sharp release. The pistol had no semi-automatic action either, which might seem a step backwards for a weapon of its era. But this was, again, a deliberate choice rather than a limitation. A manually operated bolt meant no clattering slide mechanism to betray the shooter with metallic noise as the weapon cycled, and no ejected cartridge case flung out to ping off a cobblestone and roll away as evidence for the first passer-by to find. After each shot, the operator had to manually cycle the bolt to chamber the next round, a fraction of a second slower than an automatic pistol, but silent where an automatic pistol was not. And for the purposes for which the Welrod was designed, that trade-off made perfect sense. The magazine, holding just 6 rounds, was built directly into the wooden grip rather than protruding awkwardly from the frame, keeping the profile of the weapon slim and unremarkable in silhouette. The whole weapon measured around 31 centimeters from tip to tail, close to the length of a rolled-up newspaper, and weighed roughly 1.1 kilograms unloaded, light enough to be carried comfortably inside a coat or strapped beneath a jacket without printing an obvious outline against the fabric. Independent tests at the time suggested it reduced the report of a standard 9mm pistol shot to somewhere in the region of 73 decibels at close range, comparable to the hum of a busy office rather than a gunshot, though the true figure varied considerably with the specific ammunition used and the conditions of the test. In practical terms, witnesses who heard a Welrod fired at short range in an enclosed space often described it not as a bang at all, but as a dull, wooden thud easily mistaken for a book being dropped or a door closing somewhere in the building. Manufacturing was deliberately spread across several small British workshops and machine shops, each producing only a portion of the components, to avoid drawing attention to any single facility producing an unusual volume of pistol parts. Final assembly and testing were carried out at Aston House itself, in that unremarkable barn, where each completed weapon would have been test-fired into sandboxes or padded containers to muffle the sound even during production. Because SOE's own production records were classified for decades after the war, and many were deliberately destroyed or simply lost in the chaos of post-war reorganization, historians still argue over exact production figures. Most estimates generally place total output somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 units across the war years, a modest number by the standards of mass-produced service weapons like the Lee Enfield, of which several million were made, but entirely fitting for a tool meant for a handful of specialists rather than an entire army. Records of the Welrod's actual battlefield use are frustratingly thin, and any documentary maker who tells you otherwise is embellishing rather than reporting. What survives are fragments scattered across resistance memoirs, post-war debriefings, and the occasional SOE file that escaped destruction. References to a silenced pistol used against German officers and known collaborators in occupied France and the Netherlands. Accounts from Jedburgh teams operating behind the lines after D-Day in the summer of 1944, who carried Welrods for close quarters elimination of sentries during sabotage raids on rail lines and communication centers, and post-war interviews with SOE veterans who spoke, often reluctantly and only many years later, of specific assassinations carried out with a weapon that made almost no sound at all. One account, passed down through resistance circles in the Netherlands, describes an operation in which a German officer, known for his brutality towards local civilians, was found dead in his own quarters, with no sound heard by anyone in the building and no immediate sign of how the killer had entered or left. Whether that particular story involved a Welrod specifically cannot now be verified with certainty, but it captures precisely the effect the weapon was designed to have, not merely to kill, but to kill in a way that left the enemy uncertain, unsettled, and increasingly afraid of an adversary they could neither see nor hear coming. Because the entire purpose of the Welrod was to leave no trace, and because so many of those who used it did not survive the war or chose never to speak of what they had done afterwards, the psychological effect it had on German garrisons who began to fear an unseen enemy is, in many ways, better attested by historians than any precise body count could ever be. If you're finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know, and it costs nothing but a tap of your thumb before we carry on. Germany was not blind to the value of suppressed weapons, and its own intelligence services experimented with silenced pistols of their own throughout the war. Their approach, however, tended to involve adapting existing sidearms, such as the Walther PP, with add-on suppressors, rather than designing a purpose-built weapon from first principles the way Reeves and his team had done at Aston House. The results were serviceable, but compromised in several important ways. Bolted-on suppressors reduced report only modestly compared with a weapon engineered around silence from the outset. They added significant bulk that undermined easy concealment beneath civilian clothing, and they tended to wear out or loosen quickly under repeated use in field conditions, sometimes rattling audibly against the barrel they were meant to quiet. The Americans, working somewhat in parallel and eventually in loose cooperation with British designers, developed their own high-standard suppressed pistol for use by the Office of Strategic Services, the wartime forerunner of the CIA. This weapon shared some of the Welrod's underlying philosophy, prioritizing quiet operation for clandestine use, but it retained a semi-automatic firing action rather than the Welrod's manual bolt, trading a small amount of stealth for the ability to fire a faster follow-up shot if the first missed its mark or a second target presented itself. Both approaches had their merits, and both weapons found their way into the hands of Allied intelligence operatives before the war's end. But what set the Welrod apart, and what continued to set it apart for decades afterwards, was that it had been designed as a silent weapon from the very first sketch on the drawing board, rather than adapted or bolted together from something that already existed for another purpose entirely. That single-mindedness of purpose is precisely why specialist forces continued using variants of the Welrod design for decades after the war ended, with the direct descendant reportedly still in limited use by some units as late as the 1990s. A remarkable lifespan for a weapon conceived in a farm building during the darkest years of the Second World War. The material impact of the Welrod on the overall outcome of the war was almost certainly modest, and no serious historian claims otherwise. It was never going to sink a battleship, halt an armored division, or turn the tide of a single major battle. Its real legacy lies in two other places, both harder to measure than a body count, but arguably more significant in the long run. The first is technical. It proved conclusively that a firearm could be engineered around silence as its primary design requirement, rather than as an afterthought bolted on at the end. And that approach shaped the suppressed firearms developed by intelligence services and special forces communities across the world for the remainder of the 20th century and beyond. Modern integrally suppressed pistols used by special forces units today owe a direct conceptual debt to the work done inside that unremarkable Hertfordshire barn. The second legacy is psychological and harder still to measure, but no less real for that. It is the quiet, corrosive fear the Welrod sowed among occupying forces who came to understand, whether through rumor or grim first-hand experience, that an enemy might be standing close enough to touch, and they would never hear him arrive, never hear the shot that killed him, never know until it was already far too late. That fear, spreading quietly through garrison messes and guard posts across occupied Europe, was itself a form of resistance, one that cost nothing in open battle, but chipped steadily away at the confidence of an occupying army that believed wrongly that it controlled the streets it patrolled. Surviving examples of the Welrod can today be seen in the Imperial War Museum in London and in several specialist military and intelligence collections around the world, small, unassuming objects behind glass that give little hint to the casual visitor of what they once were built to do in the dead of night, in cellars and alleyways and farmhouse kitchens across occupied Europe. Visitors often walk straight past the case without a second glance, which is, in a strange way, entirely fitting for a weapon whose entire purpose had always been to go unnoticed. Return for a moment to that barn near Aston in the winter of 1942. Outside, an ordinary English farm sits quiet under a darkening sky. Chickens settled for the night, gates latched, nothing to see for anyone passing on the lane. A dog barks once more in the distance and falls silent again. Inside, under bare electric bulbs, men are still working, turning brass and rubber and seasoned wood into something that will soon travel, hidden inside a parachute container packed with straw for cushioning, to a farmhouse in occupied France, a cellar in the Netherlands, a barn not unlike the one in which it was born. And there, it will do its quiet, terrible work in a language that needs no interpreter and leaves behind almost nothing for the enemy to find. This was Britain's answer to what had seemed, in the desperate months after Dunkirk, an entirely impossible problem. How do you fight back against an occupying army with almost nothing left in the cupboard but ingenuity, desperation, and a handful of engineers working in a converted barn? The answer, it turned out, was not louder. It was not bigger. It was not a matter of matching the enemy gun for gun or tank for tank, because Britain could not do that in 1940, and everybody in that barn knew it. Instead, the answer was quieter than anything that had come before it, small enough to hide in a coat pocket, cheap enough to produce in the low thousands rather than the millions. And it was built of all the unlikely places in wartime Britain, behind the doors of a barn that nobody thought to look at twice. That, in the end, is the truest measure of what Station 9 achieved at Aston House. It hid in plain sight, it worked in silence, and in doing both so completely, so thoroughly, it left barely a mark on the official historical record, while leaving an outsized mark on the war itself. One felt not in the headlines of the time, but in the quiet fear of individual soldiers standing sentry duty in occupied towns, wondering every single night whether tonight might be the night the silence finally came for them. Some weapons win battles in a single afternoon, loud and visible, and instantly recorded in the history books. This one did something quieter, slower, and in many ways harder to achieve. It helped keep resistance alive, one silent, unrecorded moment at a time, in barns and cellars and alleyways across an occupied continent, built first in an ordinary English farmyard, where nothing on the surface was ever meant to seem unusual at all.